Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for joining this Tyler Prize event, Earth at the Ballot Box, What's at Stake at the US election. With me, I have Professor Mike Mann. Before we get into that, I just want to give you an overview of today. So my name's Jade Lovell. I'm the CEO of Reagency Media. We represent the Tyler Prize for Environmental Science, of which Michael Mann was our 2019 Tyler Prize laureate. I'll give a quick introduction to Mike, then he will give his remarks on the US election. Then there will be a press conference where everyone's invited to ask their questions. If you have a question, please put your hand up, and Kristen, who's running the show in the background, will invite the person to speak. Or you can use the chat to ask your question. And we just want to recognize there'll be one question and one follow-up per person, just to keep things fair. This session will go for 45 minutes, so we'll finish at 1:45. So just to give you a bit of quick background on the Tyler Prize, established by John and Alice Tyler in 1973, so we've just had our 50th anniversary. The Tyler Prize for Environmental Achievement recognises global leaders in environmental science and sustainability. It's considered the world's most prestigious environmental science prize, and it's often called the Nobel Prize for the Environment. Past winners include Jane Goodall, E.O. Wilson, Jared Diamond, Daniel Pauly. Johan Rockström is the 2024 winner, and of course, Michael Mann. And we're administered by the University of Southern California. So today, Michael will be representing the Tyler Prize, but speaking for himself. Quick introduction to Professor Michael Mann. He has been elected to the National Academy of Sciences in 2020. He's best known for co-authoring the landmark hockey stick graph of climate change. He's a Presidential Distinguished Professor in the Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences at the University of Pennsylvania. He is also just recently received, he's been named the inaugural Vice President for Climate Science, Policy and Action. That will be effective November 1st, just a few days before the US election. He's the author of several books, including Our Fragile Moment and The New Climate War. He has a new one coming out with Peter Hotez called Science Under Siege, and appears regularly in the mainstream media all around the world, and was recently listed in the Independent's Climate 100. So without further ado, I will hand over to Mike for an introduction on the state of what's at stake in the US election.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jade, for that very kind introduction. And thanks to all of you here for coming out for this event. I'll be blunt. This really, this upcoming election is a critical juncture where Americans will choose one of two paths, and the difference between those two paths couldn't be more stark. One of those paths, that represented by Donald Trump, the Republican Party, involves basically abandoning the efforts that we've already made here in the United States to tackle the climate crisis. That includes dismantling the EPA, getting rid of the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, which of course runs the National Hurricane Center, and the hurricane hunters that make the measurements take their lives, put their lives at risk flying into hurricanes to make critical measurements that are fed into our models so we can better predict the intensification and the paths of these dangerous storms. It would abandon all that. But fundamentally, it would abandon our commitments to the rest of the world to lead on this issue, to reduce our carbon emissions, to incentivize a shift away from fossil fuels. It would seek to, for example, deactivate the Inflation Reduction Act, which was landmark legislation passed by the Biden administration or signed by Joe Biden, passed by Congress, that the provisions of which have the potential to lower our carbon emissions here in the United States by 40% by 2030. It's not enough. We need to do even more. We need to build on that, but it puts us on the right path. And so you have on the one hand, a Republican Party and their presidential nominee, Donald Trump, who would, in essence, end any U.S. leadership on climate. And in the absence of U.S. leadership, we are the world's largest legacy carbon polluter. We have to display moral leadership if we can expect the rest of the world to come to the table, other industrializing nations, China, India, et cetera. And what we know is that when we do take leadership, as we did during the Obama administration, and again during the Biden administration, then those other countries come to the table and we begin to forge a path forward to truly take the actions necessary to avert catastrophic warming. Look, we're at 1.2 Celsius warming now. At 1.5 Celsius, 3 Fahrenheit, we will start to see far worse consequences than those that we're already seeing. And we're already seeing dangerous climate change just in the last month or so with Hurricane Helene, Hurricane Milton. These are storms that were amplified. They were more intense. They produced greater amounts of flooding rains that in one case killed hundreds of people. We are witnessing the devastating consequences of human-caused climate change. And if we don't take action now and prevent warming of 1.5 Celsius, and right, we're already at 1.2, there isn't a whole lot of wiggle room. And what it basically means is we've got to ramp carbon emissions down dramatically over the next decade, bring them down to zero mid-century. The only hope to do that would be to build on the policies that were put in place by the Biden administration. And so that's where we stand. We have a monumental choice before us. It's not getting, in my view, as much coverage as it ought to in the US media, because wow, there are so many crises we face, public health crises, international security crises, wars, et cetera. If we don't act now on the climate crisis, there's no going back. We lock in truly dangerous and deadly consequences for decades to come. And so that's where we are at this very critical juncture. And I'm here in the city of Philadelphia that may, in the state of Pennsylvania, that may ultimately play a critical role in determining who wins this election and which of those paths we take. And so that's where we are. I look forward to your questions and delving into this further.
Thank you for that, Mike. So if you do have a question for Mike, please pop your hand up, and Kristen, who is running the back end, will refer you to Mike and unmute your microphone.
I see one.
We'll go with Marianne.
Hi, Marianne. I'm a freelance reporter. I work for science journals and mainstream media alike. I was quite interested to see that with Hurricane Helene, we saw a lot of conspiracy theories emerging from the public. I'd be quite interested to hear what you think are the dynamics that have been pushing these conspiracy theory forward, and also what climate scientists, what are the points of pressures that climate scientists can apply to combat these conspiracy theories?
Yeah, thanks, Marianne. It's a great question, and it does relate to this book that I'm writing with Peter Hotez, Science Under Siege, because it's about this dual assault that we face, whether it's the sort of public health science that Peter's known for, developing vaccines, and he's had death threats, and he has been hauled into Congress by adversarial Republicans trying to discredit him. That what Peter's gone through over the last year or two is very similar to what I went through actually 2 decades ago. And I've sometimes said that the bad faith discourse over human-caused climate change, which we were facing in the 1990s, literally fake news, alternative facts, all of those things, disinformation, things that have become part of the popular lexicon today, we were dealing with that. And I sometimes think of it as it was almost like it was a localized cancer that is now metastasized to impact our entire body politic, so that we have, FEMA representatives, we have television weather presenters who are threatened, who are attacked simply for presenting the facts of the weather or trying to help people recover from the devastating consequences of these extreme weather events. And so we've arrived at a very dangerous place that was frankly, in some sense, prophesied by, Carl Sagan back in the 1990s with The Demon Haunted World, you can find this passage from the book where he warns of a future where people have become disconnected, scientific illiteracy. They can't understand technology, and they become prone to efforts to misinform and disinform them by people and institutions with with an agenda. And that's what we're witnessing. Unfortunately, his worst fears have come true. And so we're seeing that with public health, we're seeing that with climate, and we're now seeing that with even weather presenters trying to predict and inform the public about the threat from these powerful hurricanes that we're witnessing. Who's behind it? There's quite a bit of evidence that there are bad state actors, and Russia foremost among them, Saudi Arabia for certain. Saudi Arabia has been trying to poison the well with global climate action for decades because they are, their real only primary economic resource is the fossil fuels that they want to extract and sell to the world. And so Saudi Arabia, is a petrostate that has sought to sort of poison the well on climate for years. But you've got Russia, which has played a more prominent role. Again, it's a petrostate. Their primary resource is their fossil fuels. They also see sort of Western democracy as a threat to their political system and their business interests at the same time. And so there's really been this conspiracy and this collaboration between multiple bad actors. You've got fossil fuel industry front groups that have been doing this sort of stuff, dark ops, if you will, psyops, online, cyber warfare, have been engaged in this for years. But you've got state actors like Saudi Arabia and Russia, and then you have arguably, the world's wealthiest and most powerful individual, Elon Musk, who is a full-blown conspiracy theorist, climate denier, who's weaponized the closest thing that I think we have to a public square in our global society, Twitter now, as yet another medium for promoting misinformation and disinformation with a political agenda to elect another authoritarian, Donald Trump, who would basically implement a petrostate-like business model, if you will, for the United States. We would become part of that coalition with Russia and Saudi Arabia and other bad actors.
Thanks very much. If I can have one follow-up question. As you said, this is a conversation that's been going on for since the 90s, at least among the scientific community. Why haven't we gotten better at communicating and fighting these conspiracy theories? And what advice would you have for scientists today in this pressing time of need?
Thanks so much for that. Another great question. It's a question that Peter and I try to answer, right? Because it's easy to describe the problem, and we lay it out in great detail. And each of us have episodes from our own lives that I think vividly sort of convey what we face today. But the real, what people really want to know is, what can we do about it? And you allude to something that's really important. There's no question scientific literacy is critical. We've got to do a better job, educating people about not just about science as figures and facts, but about sort of the philosophy of science. Why my good friend and colleague Naomi Oreskes wrote this wonderful book, Why We Trust Science, or Why We Should Trust Science. And people need to understand how science works, why it is that we, the self-correcting machinery of science that Carl Sagan so eloquently described, why it is that we should trust science. That's really important. That's as important as just giving them facts and figures, and providing them the tools for critical thinking, obviously, because that's really important in science, but it's really important in every aspect of modern life. Critical thinking underlies all of this. At the same time, though, we have to recognize that we're not operating in a vacuum. We have this stiff headwind of disinformation, of concerted disinformation that we're fighting against. And I sometimes think that scientists get blamed a little too much because we are like, Boy Scouts fighting the Marines. I mean, the other side is so well organized, so well funded, and scientists are doing the best that they can, but we lack the infrastructure. One of the things that Peter and I argue is that we've got to provide more resources for young scientists in particular, to incentivize them going into communication. That should be a viable career path in science, and there isn't enough support for it right now in terms of sort of just support, moral support, encouragement from educators and from scientists, but financial support so that that's a viable career. One of the things we have to think about in education, and here at Penn, as the new vice provost for climate, it's something that I'm going to have to think about quite a bit. Do we sort of follow suit with what UCSD? You may have heard this development just last week. UCSD became the first major institution, major university in the U.S. to have a climate requirement for graduation. Do we need sort of the climate and I would say more broadly sustainability? Do we want to make that a requirement so that every student who graduates college understands that? But even before they get to college, we've got to be teaching school children the tools and presenting them with the facts, because this is about their future. They need to understand the threat to their future. And once again, we face those same bad actors who have done everything they can to coerce textbook authors into leaving out discussions of climate change. In Florida, Ron DeSantis, in Florida has basically banned, from Florida textbooks, the discussions of climate change, among other things that he finds inconvenient. And so it's a multi-pronged, challenge. And there's no magic bullet. It involves scientific literacy. It involves political organizing, being in a position to push back against bad actors who are promoting misinformation and disinformation, and changing sort of the culture of the public's understanding of what science is, how it works, and why we should trust it, and arming them not just with the facts and figures, but the tools of critical thinking so that they can navigate. Because you can do an hour-long lecture on climate change, but then a member of your audience goes on social media, is subject to seemingly convincing claims. How can we sort of give them the tools to litigate that themselves, give them resources that they can go to online, the National Academies of Sciences, the reports of the National Academies of Sciences, or AAAS, Sciline is a wonderful resource. Factcheck.org here, based at the University of Pennsylvania, founded by my good friend and colleague Kathleen Hall Jameson, and they have a SciCheck now, which is it's within factcheck.org is an entity that's focused specifically on refuting misinformation and disinformation in the scientific sphere. So that's it's a lot to do. There's a lot to do, but I think that again, if this election goes the way some of us hope it will go, and then there's an opportunity to move forward on these fronts. If it doesn't, it's going to be a real challenge.
Thanks for asking that $1 million question, Marianne. I'll hand over to the next question to Polita Clark.
Hello.
Hello,
Hi,
Polita.
Mike. Yes,
Hi.
hi, Mike. Hopefully you can hear me. I'm sorry you can't see me. I've got fairly ordinary internet connection, so I think that
No worries. It's great to sort of virtually meet all folks that I've interacted with so much in the past, to sort of meet you here virtually. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've got two questions, actually. You mentioned the media's coverage of climate during the election, and the fact that I think you, like many other people, are slightly disappointed that there hasn't been quite as much of that coverage as you would have liked. And I just wonder if you could comment on the reasons you think that's happening, and just then more broadly, how would you characterize the media's coverage of climate in general, not just in the US and in relation to the election? That's the first question. And the second question is, when it comes to what Project 2025 says about NOAA and other agencies, have you heard from any scientists or researchers or analysts who, I don't know if I can say are working for the agencies but are involved with those agencies, but who are thinking of taking any kind of preemptive action or are considering any sort of measures that could protect them from what Project 2025 is threatening to do to those agencies?
Yeah, this is a great question. Both questions, Polita, and I'll take the second one first, actually, because we just had the EPA Chief of Staff here doing. I did a fireside chat with him yesterday here at Penn during our Climate Week, and
Right.
yeah, and he talked a little bit about some of the Trump proofing. He didn't call it that, and of course, he has to remain entirely nonpartisan in his engagement with the public. But reading between the lines, they have taken quite a few steps to Trump proof with EPA as much as possible, and I think we see the very same thing going on within other government agencies like NOAA. That having been said, there's only so much you can do, right? Especially in an environment where the Supreme Court has basically declared the chief executive king, and there's no knowing what a second-term President Trump might try to do, what sort of abuses of executive authority we might encounter. Project 2025 is quite grim. And if that was implemented in full, it's difficult to see how the Trump proofing survives that sort of onslaught. So that's a matter of great concern. With regard to the media, and so they're shining examples. I'm always a little apprehensive to sort of make broad brush statements about the media, because you've done a wonderful job. Most of the people on this call, of course, I think are people in the environmental and science journalism world who care a lot about this and have been, doing a lot. And so where what happens, and certain networks, obviously BBC has done a great job. The Guardian newspaper here, in terms of the news network, sorry, MSNBC. I've been on MSNBC and CNN. Probably between the two networks 9 or 10 times over the last month, because there were two windows of opportunity. There was the General Assembly, the UN General Assembly, and Climate Week in New York a few weeks ago, and that's sort of an opportunity. Everybody's there in New York. The studios are right there. I was able to convince MSNBC, for example, to have us on for a live segment about about the threat. And it turns out it coincided with Milton and Helene. And so there was this sort of galvanizing sequence of events that sort of crystallizes the climate threat in a way that does provide windows of opportunity, those that are few and far between, but it provides windows of opportunity to penetrate this very thick sort of almost an impenetrable political news cycle that we're in right now, driven by Trump and the election. It's really difficult to find the opportunities. And you might say, well, this is the defining challenge of our time, and there's no more relevant election sort of news, election matter than what's going to happen with climate, because there are other problems, short-term problems that we can deal with and get past, but this problem doesn't go away. And if we fail to act now, we lock in irreversible consequences. So you could argue, so why aren't we hearing much more about climate? And what I would say in defense of some of these journalistic outlets is that you can forget progress on climate or just about anything else if we lose our democracy. And so the threat to democratic governance in the United States is a threat to everything we care about. And it is paramount. It is of greater importance than anything else, because there is no path to meaningful global climate action that doesn't go through a committed United States. And the United States, the world's largest legacy polluter, doing its due diligence, doing all it can. And we know that when that happens, other countries come to the table. And so if we lose our democracy, which is a real threat in a second Trump term, then it's sort of game over as far as the US is concerned with regard to climate action. And if it's game over in the US, it's game over globally, because I don't see any way that we can meet the challenge without the United States playing a leadership role.
Yeah. No, that's really interesting. Thank you. I mean, I won't. I'm sure other people have other questions, so I'll wait to ask another one unless
Okay.
nobody else does. In which
Thanks
case,
so much. Thanks.
yeah.
Thanks for that segue, Polita. So if there's any other questions, please do put your hand up. This is a reminder that this session will not be released to the public, so your questions are on the record, but they will be exclusive to you. And I think we have Edward Carpenter. Edward.
Great. Hello. Can't hear you.
There we go. Sorry about that.
No problem.
Michael, I appreciate that. I missed the hand and arm signal. And as a former Marine, I appreciate the difficulty of fighting the equivalent of us with the equivalent of Boy Scouts. So it's good that we have some textbooks. And the subject of your next book is Science Under Siege, the Assault on Climate Science. And you've spoken about how democracy is what you believe to be one of the prerequisites for meaningful action on climate change.
Yeah.
And in your response earlier, you mentioned the importance of science education and critical thinking, moral and financial support for young science. But what about the pillars of democratic systems? So legislative, executive, and judiciary in the government, and the civic, bureaucratic, and business structures that sort of underlie them. And I'm sort of curious how you think the democratic systems, as opposed to any other system of governance and society, can help normalize the use of scientific policy in making decisions on climate change.
Yeah, thanks. It's a great question. And, an argument has been made that sort of authoritative regimes, China being sort of a great example, authoritarian regimes, countries that aren't democracies that have sort of a command and control sort of approach to government. Some people argue they might actually be better situated to act on something like climate because you can make a decision at the very top and execute that decision very efficiently. Here in the United States, of course, you've got to fight for legislation. You need more than 50 votes in the House of in the Senate rather, and the Inflation Reduction Act, for example, suffered from that because the 50th vote was a coal state Democrat, Joe Manchin, who basically demanded that much of there was carrot, for renewable energy, and there's stick for fossil fuel energy, and the stick for the fossil fuel industry basically was eliminated in order to get that 50th vote, which Kamala Harris was then able to sign into law, to vote so that the president could sign into law. Break the tie. So part, in the United States, democracy means that if voters turn out in substantial enough numbers driven by issues like climate, and in this case, it does break down, there's no way to be nonpartisan here because one of the two parties, the Democratic Party, really does stand for additional progress in climate. The other collectively dismisses it essentially as a hoax or a non-problem, and is in bed with the fossil fuel industry, receives a lot of funding from the fossil fuel industry, and has been collaborating with petrostates like Russia to some extent. So it's clear that one of the two. So if you have substantial democratic control of Congress, a democratic president, you could pass more aggressive legislation. And so that's the way American democracy works here. If enough voters turn out and vote for pro-climate Democrats, we could get a more aggressive bill than the Inflation Reduction Act, which it's great. It gets us on the path, but it doesn't go far enough. In particular, it was lacking sort of the stick, something like a clean energy standard that would penalize utilities for not that aren't moving rapidly enough towards renewable energy. You need some sort of incentive of that sort, in my view, to achieve the sorts of reductions we really need. But then in our system, you've also got a Supreme Court, and right now we have seen sort of, in my view, we're seeing a slow burn constitutional crisis. What we're seeing is a Supreme Court that has fundamentally shifted sort of the balance of power by declaring Donald Trump essentially a king, that their president exercising their presidential responsibilities can basically do anything they want. On the one hand. On the other hand, when Congress, votes for legislation, or rather, actually, when presidents issue executive orders, take executive actions like Biden has tried to do with offshore oil drilling on public lands, we've had this pushback from the court. And so to really advance climate policy to the extent necessary, to be able to take full advantage of the legislative and executive branches, you need a Supreme Court that isn't going to basically block the critical executive actions, hamstring the EPA in terms. And there was a you may have heard there was a minor victory for the EPA the other day, that the Supreme Court refused to. They stayed this challenge to the EPA and its ability to regulate pollutants. So there was a minor victory there. But overall, the Supreme Court has taken an adversarial role when it comes to executive actions on climate. And, how do you change that? Well, you've got to change the composition of the Supreme Court. And that takes a sustained, as we know, sort of sustained electoral participation on the part of voters who care about these things.
Thank you for that question, Edward. If we don't have any other questions or any other hands up, we'll go back to Polita. And you have another question, Polita.
Yeah, thanks for those great questions. I'd love to hear questions from others too. Don't be bashful on my behalf, please.
Well, if there's nobody else, I'll venture forth again.
Always happy to talk with you, Polita.
So you mentioned the role of petrostates and the influence of petrostates, and of course we have another petrostate hosting this year's COP in Azerbaijan in a few weeks' time.
Yeah.
And some people, notably Al Gore and others, have suggested that the UN needs to reform its processes so that this is not necessarily going to be as easy as it is currently in the future. And I just wonder, what do you think about that idea? Do you think it makes sense to try to limit access of a country like Azerbaijan to hosting something like a climate COP? Or do you think that these countries need to be brought in and have a kind of a seat at the table at some point so that pressure can be applied?
Yeah, and I know that's the argument that's made. It's funny, I actually wrote an op-ed in the LA Times with my colleague Susan Joy Hassel after COP28, making precisely, actually very similar arguments to the ones that you describe from Al Gore. Arguing first of all that we shouldn't, at a minimum, we shouldn't be allowing petrostates to continue to host these conferences, because it leads to a total loss of confidence among Gen Z, young youth climate activists and advocates who have become cynical about our ability to reach a consensus and to take the actions necessary. It understandably entirely feeds that cynicism when these COP meetings are hosted by petrostates, flooded by fossil fuel lobbyists. There are more fossil fuel lobbyists than there are scientists now at these events. And when, the process yields weak language, like, we will, I forget, no commitment, for example, to phase out fossil fuels. What we need is a commitment with a specific timeline to phase out fossil fuels. And none of the conferences have yet been able to come to a consensus on such wording, in part because of this system where it just takes one bad actor, one bad apple, to spoil the, as we say in the stateside here, one bad apple to spoil the bunch. All it takes is one bad petrostate actor like Saudi Arabia or Russia to block an agreement. And then everybody's got to go back to the drawing board and find language. that where they can get a unanimous consent from all of the participating countries. I just think that is an impossibly high bar, and it's too high a bar for us to achieve meaningful climate action. And so there's been an argument made in the past, and Susan and I advocate for, there should be a rule like 67% of nation states need to support a motion for it to pass, not unanimous. Unanimous is just an impossibly high standard. Yeah, so I mean, so it's not just the fact that these, that these conferences are being hosted by petrostates, but the current rules right now are prohibitively stringent to get any meaningful, agreement. Anything that rises to, that meets the moment, meets the challenge that we face.
Right. Yes. Yeah. I mean, I do have another question, but I don't want to butt in. I'm sure others probably would like to come in, but
Polliga, you're welcome to ask it. We have one more question that's been submitted by Rebecca Rhodes in the UK, but if you want to ask yours, then we'll still have time for that one as well, unless there's anyone else that puts their hand up.
Oh, no, I mean, Rebecca,
I'll keep my answers shorter too, so maybe we can get through a few more. Yeah.
I shall cede my place to Rebecca. Thank you.
No worries.
All right. Rebecca's question was submitted to Kristen. Kristen, would you be able to read it out for Mike?
Sure. Rebecca was asking, why do you think climate change hasn't been a bigger feature of the campaigns of both candidates?
Yeah, great question, Rebecca. It's frustrating to some of us that, well, we know that Donald Trump doesn't want to talk about climate change, because there was a question in the one presidential debate, that final question, and many of us were wondering, is there even going to be a question about climate change? And then we got to the very end of that debate, and there was a question about climate change. And Donald Trump answered, his answer made absolutely no reference to climate change. So it's clear where that candidate stands. But Kamala Harris's comments were disappointing to some climate activists. She acknowledged the existential threat that climate change poses to us, and I think that's really important. But then she did sort of go into this diversionary discussion of jobs, and in essence, the need to to provide jobs in Pennsylvania, in the natural gas industry, the reason that we need to allow for continued natural gas extraction. And there's clear realpolitik there. They understand that any path towards an electoral map victory goes through Pennsylvania. There's no question about that. And I think that they're convinced that there are enough sort of moderate conservatives, for example, that are potentially winnable, and they may need them, who actually feel that natural gas extraction is an important part of the economy of the state, that those jobs are important. And so I think there's a concession that's being made there. It's the reason that you don't see Kamala Harris taking a stand against additional natural gas extraction drilling. Now, you could say on the one hand, well, that's really bad. We need the Democratic candidate standing up for this issue. It's the defining challenge we face, and it's what most distinguishes these two parties, in my view. And we need a more sort of proactive stance. I think in their defense, in Kamala Harris's defense, their belief, and it's clearly embodied in the approach that Joe Biden took, is that you can get there through demand side measures. If you put enough incentives in there for renewable energy, and so you sort of create the right incentive structure in the energy market, then it becomes prohibitively expensive to drill for additional oil or natural gas. And so you sort of change the rules on the supply, on the demand side, rather. You shift demand towards renewable energy. And if you can make enough progress that way, then it's less necessary to sort of take what might be feel like very heavy-handed supply side measures, telling natural gas companies that they can't drill, trying to bar new fossil fuel infrastructure, especially when every time the Biden administration has tried to do that, they've been turned back by a conservative court system that's stacked against them. In that environment, it's difficult to get those supply side measures passed. What you have available to you is the demand side. And I think that's why we've seen that approach. Now, given a change in the political complexion and Supreme Court, the makeup of the Supreme Court, which will be critical, and I think the Democrats have to be thinking about expanding the Supreme Court, because in the absence of that, executive actions are basically going to be off the table. These supply side actions are basically going to be off the table, and all you'll have is the demand side. But you can make progress that way. I think that's the view that the Harris campaign is taking here.
Thanks for another great question, Polita. We have a follow-up question from Marianne.
Great.
Hi, I'll try and make this quick so that other questions can come in. To your point that climate change isn't getting enough attention, are there specific stories that have been completely underreported? And what will you be looking out for at the next COP that is at risk of being overlooked by reporters?
Yeah, great questions, both of those. COP, I would say we've made some progress, like loss and damage, at the fringes, but the thing to look out for is, as we were talking about before, is the UN going to take some measures to dissuade bad actors or to dilute their impact? Because as long as they don't, Saudi Arabia, Russia, and a few others are going to scuttle any effort for bolder language, agreement on a phase out on a timely time frame. So that's I would say that's the thing to look at in terms of stories to tell. One of the great untold stories, in my view, and sometimes it's a matter of editorial framing as much as the story. Because there have been stories about the deadly floods associated with Helene, and those stories often, will mention that climate change exacerbated the flooding. There was a study that you may have seen that the human-caused warming increased by 50% the amount of rainfall with Helene in the mountainous regions of the southeastern U.S. And that means people died from climate change. That's the way it ought to be framed. The flooding was made significantly worse. Hundreds of people died from that flooding. So we are witnessing climate change caused mortality. And I think, again, it's not so much that the basic facts haven't gotten out, but that it isn't being framed that way. Climate change is disastrous for our economy. That's another thing to talk about. The cost of these devastating events greatly outweighs any cost of taking action. In fact, why do we even call it a cost when we talk about renewable energy, taking climate action, and we allow the other side to talk about the investment in new fossil fuel infrastructure? Why is new fossil fuel infrastructure an investment, but renewable energy is a cost? It's because of the way the language has been gamed. And again, it comes down to sort of editorial framing sometimes. So I would say that I don't have too many qualms with sort of the journalism that's being done here, but the placement, the framing, the editorial framing, and the placement. Why isn't this stuff front page above the fold, at the top of the news hour, prime time? Because this is the defining threat, the defining challenge of our time. Thanks.
Another great question, Marianne. Thank you so much. It's 1:45, so we're going to end it there. But I just want to say a huge thank you to our 2019 Tyler Prize laureate, Michael Mann, for making the time, and to everyone that attended and asked such great questions. It's definitely a critical time in the US and for the entire world at the moment. So I'm so glad we got to have this discussion. The 2025 Tyler Prize laureate will be decided in the next few weeks. So we'll be in touch when we find out who that person is. But they'll definitely have big shoes to fill. So Michael, thank you so much for making the time. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Jade. It was truly my pleasure. And to the journalists still on the call, you're always free to reach out to me as well by email for any follow-up, mann@michaelmann.net.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Have a great
Thanks.
day, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.